Usually, when you pick up a historical biography, there's this very comforting expectation of, precision.
Right, you want the facts, you want the exact dates.
Exactly. You expect a foundation poured from solid concrete. You look at the timeline, it's linear, and the historian is basically acting as a tour guide, just pointing at the scenery saying, there it is. That happened on this day in this exact order.
And it creates this really binary framework for how we process the past, doesn't it? Like, something is either hard, factual history, or it's just pure fiction.
Yeah, because it feels clean, it's manageable.
Yeah.
We desperately want our historical figures to be just categorized and set in stone.
Oh, totally. But the moment you step out of modern history and wade into, well, the world of ancient religious texts and translation history,
That solid concrete foundation just instantly turns into sand.
it really does. It completely disintegrates.
It's a landscape that is completely murky. And so, for today's deep dive, we are taking a figure that everyone thinks they know inside and out, and we are just dismantling that familiar narrative from the ground up.
Which is a massive undertaking, by the way.
Oh yeah, we are pulling from a huge, diverse stack of sources today. We've got canonical texts, deep Greek linguistic scholarship, and some really fascinating alternative accounts like the Gospel of the Holy 12 and the visions recorded in the Dolorous Passion.
Our mission today is to essentially reconstruct a chronological timeline of his life, from birth through those heavily debated missing years, his personal life, the ministry, and post-resurrection.
Right, but we're including the details that have been entirely lost to the friction of history and really the heavy filter of translation.
Yes, and before we take a single step into that timeline, we really need to draw a hard line in the sand about how we're approaching all this material.
Yeah, that is a crucial disclaimer for anyone listening right now.
It really is, because we are dealing with religious, historical, and honestly highly controversial texts today.
I mean, we're talking about accounts that detail a literal marriage, alternative gospels that challenge standard Orthodox narratives.
Radical interpretations of parables everyone knows. So we need to be clear, we are acting strictly as impartial guides through this landscape.
Exactly. We are not taking a side. We're not endorsing any specific theological or historical viewpoints, Orthodox or alternative. Our only goal is to convey the fascinating ideas contained within this specific stack of sources so you, the listener, can understand the sheer scope of what has been debated and believed over the centuries.
Right, and to even begin looking at these texts, we first have to understand the incredibly flawed lens through which the modern world usually reads them.
The translation filter.
Yes, because if you are reading an English translation of an ancient Greek manuscript, you are essentially looking at a heavily compressed JPEG image instead of the original uncompressed raw data file.
That is such a good way to frame it. Because
Well,
think about what a JPEG compression algorithm actually does, right? To make a file smaller, the algorithm just averages out the adjacent pixels.
exactly. It throws away the subtle gradients of color, it flattens out those deep shadows, it blurs the sharp edges.
And English translation does the exact same thing to ancient Greek grammar. It just averages out all the nuance for the sake of modern readability.
It really does. Our sources on biblical Greek highlight this brilliantly. Greek is an inflected language.
So for someone who, hasn't taken a linguistics class, what does that actually mean when we're staring at a page of text?
Well, in English, the meaning of a sentence relies almost entirely on word order. Like, the dog bit the man means something completely different than the man bit the dog.
Right, obviously.
But in an inflected language like Greek, the words themselves actually change their structural form, their spelling, their endings. They change to reflect their exact grammatical function, regardless of where they sit in the sentence.
Oh, wow. So you could scramble the words up.
Exactly. Greek authors could scramble the word order to emphasize certain ideas or create poetry without losing the grammatical meaning at all. But here's the kicker. A massive component of that inflection is gender.
Right, because modern English relies heavily on the word it for animals and objects. We just strip the gender away completely.
But Greek explicitly assigns a gender masculine, feminine, or neuter to animals, things, and abstract concepts.
I want to stop and think about that for a second, because I feel like we really underestimate how much that changes human psychology.
Oh, it changes everything about how you perceive reality.
Right. If your native language forces you to categorize every single object in your house, every animal and every abstract concept as either masculine or feminine, you are interacting with the world on a totally different symbolic level.
It fundamentally alters the architecture of your storytelling. Let's look at a prime example from the sources, the parables in the Gospel of Luke about rejoicing over lost possessions.
These are, I mean, some of the most famous stories ever told.
Right, so in the first parable, a man loses a single sheep. He leaves his flock, searches the wilderness, finds the sheep, puts it on his shoulders, goes home, and then calls his friends and neighbors together to rejoice.
A completely straightforward pastoral story.
But then, immediately following that, the text gives us a mirrored story. A woman loses a single silver coin, she lights a lamp, sweeps the entire house, finds it, and calls her friends and neighbors together to rejoice.
Right, so in the English JPEG version, the text just says, friends and neighbors in both parables.
Exactly. The data is entirely flattened.
But when you look at the original Greek, the raw file, the social reality of the first century Mediterranean world snaps into hyperfocus.
It really does, because the words for friends and neighbors in the story about the man are specifically inflected as masculine.
Wow.
And in the story about the woman, those exact same nouns for friends and neighbors are explicitly inflected as feminine.
So the man called his male friends and male neighbors, and the woman called her female friends and female neighbors.
Yes, and the English translation completely erases this division. In ancient Judean culture, social gatherings were heavily segregated by sex.
So the author was constructing these parables to resonate distinctly with the two different demographic halves of his audience.
Exactly. The men listening would envision their specific male social circles celebrating the livestock, while the women would envision their specific domestic circles celebrating the recovered currency.
And by compressing those distinct gendered Greek words into the neutral English phrase, friends and neighbors, we completely lose our understanding of the community dynamics he was speaking into.
We lose the cultural texture completely, but there's an even more intense example that totally shifts a massive historical moment.
Oh, right, from the Gospel of John. During that highly contentious exchange at the temple in Jerusalem, he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
And this isn't just a throwaway line. This is the specific statement that the religious elite used against him at his trial to secure his execution.
Right, they claimed he was an insurrectionist threatening to physically dismantle a massive building.
But our sources, specifically the Greek scholar Maurice A. Robinson's supplementary aids, show us exactly how the English translation fails the genius of the original statement.
Because in Greek, the word for temple, which is naos, is a masculine noun.
Which means the pronoun referring back to it must also be masculine.
Exactly. The pronoun that modern English translators render as it is actually a masculine pronoun in the original text. So reading literally, the statement is, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise him up.
Yes. And because the speaker himself is masculine, the grammar creates a flawless, deliberate double entendre.
Oh, that is so clever.
The language allows the sentence to simultaneously refer to the physical architecture of the temple building and to his own physical, biological body. It holds both meanings perfectly in tension.
So the religious authorities just hear a threat against the building, but the later reader understands it as a prophecy about his body.
Right, and when English translators swap him for it, that dual meaning, the entire theological weight and the linguistic cleverness of the metaphor, is just completely wiped out. The English reader is robbed of the pun.
It's wild, but it goes so much deeper than just vocabulary choices, too.
Yeah.
We really have to visualize what these ancient manuscripts actually looked like to the people reading them.
Oh, this is where it gets really mind-bending for modern readers.
Because if you picture an ancient scroll, you probably imagine something resembling a modern book, right? Like paragraphs, indentations, periods, commas.
But the reality is incredibly jarring. The earliest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament were written in a style called scriptio continua using uncial script.
Which basically means the text was written in one continuous, unbroken string of capital letters.
Exactly. There were no spaces between the words. Zero. There were no punctuation marks, no periods, no commas, no question marks.
So if you were reading the opening of the book of Acts, you wouldn't see, the former treatise have I made, O Theophilus, about all things.
No, you would literally just see a wall of letters. THEFORMERTRETISE just smashed together, and it would just keep going until the edge of the papyrus. Yeah. The minuscule writing, the lowercase letters, and the invention of spaces and standardized punctuation, those didn't even become common until the 9th or 10th century.
Which forces us to confront a very uncomfortable truth, honestly. Every single space between words, every single comma, and every single capitalized letter you read in a modern English Bible is a later insertion.
Yes. It is not part of the original data. It's an editorial interpretation.
Wait, I have to stop you there, though. Because if the text is literally just a continuous string of letters with zero punctuation and no spaces,
Yeah.
aren't we basically reading the translator's opinion of what the text says rather than the text itself?
That is a profoundly important realization, and the answer is absolutely yes.
I mean, if you hand me a string of letters without spaces, I could probably break it up into several entirely different mathematically valid sentences just depending on where I decide to put the breaks.
Precisely. You are reading a translation of an interpretation. The translator has to make a subjective judgment call about where one word ends and another begins.
They have to decide where the thought terminates to place a period.
And crucially, they have to decide what gets capitalized.
And capitalization fundamentally changes theology. I mean, our sources highlight the phrase "in the Spirit."
Right.
If a translator decides to type "in the Spirit" with lowercase s, the modern reader interprets that as a mood or an attitude. Like the team was in good spirits. It's an emotional state.
But if the translator hits the shift key and capitalizes it "in the Spirit," it instantly transforms from an emotional state into a massive theological statement about the presence of the Holy Ghost.
And that distinction, lowercase versus uppercase, simply did not exist in the mind of the original author writing an uncial script.
It didn't. It is entirely the translator deciding what specific theology they want to inject into the text at that moment.
Unbelievable.
The Greek definite article, the word "the," behaves similarly. English uses "the" quite bluntly, but ancient Greek has a highly complex system of definite articles that clarify incredibly specific nuances of teachings.
So the original unformatted text actually required the ancient reader to actively participate, to parse the grammar in their head, to read aloud, to find the rhythm, and to hold multiple potential meanings at once.
Exactly. When modern translators lock that text down into rigid English grammar and punctuation, they are making theological choices for you. This is why returning to the Greek roots, the raw files, is mandatory if we want to build an accurate historical and theological timeline.
We have to be hyper-aware of that interpretive filter. Because if we accept that language is an active filter, then the very first thing we have to filter out is the identity of the protagonist himself.
Oh, yes, the name.
Because even the name Jesus is an artifact of this translation process. We need to completely redefine who we are talking about.
According to the linguistic and historical sources, the name Jesus is basically a multi-generational linguistic game of telephone.
It really is.
The historical figure walking around first-century Judea did not answer to the name Jesus. His Hebrew, or more accurately Aramaic, name was Yeshua, or the longer form, Jehoshua.
Which, if you translate that directly into modern English from the Hebrew, is Joshua.
Precisely. Jesus of Nazareth and the great Old Testament military commander Joshua literally share the exact same name.
That is wild to think about.
When the Greek authors wrote about him, they transliterated the sound of Yeshua into the Greek letters Isus. Later, Latin translators turned Isus into Isis, and eventually, English gave us Jesus.
It seems like a minor historical quirk, honestly, but why does it matter? Like, does calling him Jesus versus Jehoshua actually change how we understand the timeline?
It changes everything about how he was perceived by his contemporaries. The name Jehoshua means the Lord saves, or Yahweh is salvation. And as the Emmaus Code text meticulously points out, the ancient Hebrew mind was constantly looking for typological foreshadowing.
Meaning the idea that earlier historical figures and events were basically prototypes or blueprints for later greater realities.
Exactly. God prepared the Old Testament Joshua for a very specific transitional task. Moses, who represented the strict giving of the law, was not permitted to lead the Israelites across the Jordan River into the Promised Land.
Right. That task fell to Joshua. Joshua was a slave in Egypt. He served as a minister to Moses. He fought massive battles. He's the ultimate transitional figure crossing the threshold from wandering to inheritance.
And scholars argue that the New Testament authors leaned heavily into this intentional typological link, just as the first Joshua succeeded Moses to lead the people into a new physical, geographical inheritance.
Jehoshua Jesus is portrayed as succeeding the law of Moses to lead humanity into a new spiritual inheritance.
Yes. When you lay the stories side by side using the name Joshua for both, the architectural parallels in the text are staggering.
I mean, Old Testament Joshua physically parts the waters of the Jordan River so that people can cross over to a new life. New Testament Joshua physically walk on the water of the Sea of Galilee, demonstrating mastery over the chaotic elements.
It's a direct mirror. Old Testament Joshua's followers put on literal earthly armor to pull down the massive stone strongholds of Jericho. New Testament Joshua's followers are instructed by later writers like Paul to put on spiritual armor, to pull down psychological and spiritual strongholds.
Even the theological concept of rest is mirrored perfectly, isn't it?
It is. The writer of the book of Hebrews explicitly contrasts the temporary military geopolitical rest that the first Joshua secured for the Israelites in Canaan with the permanent cosmic spiritual Sabbath rest offered by the second Joshua.
So shifting his name back to its Hebrew root fundamentally shifts our perspective. It anchors him deeply in a continuous Jewish historical tradition, rather than making his arrival seem like an isolated, disconnected phenomenon with this brand new Greek-sounding name.
Exactly. And we also have to apply this to his title, the word Christ.
Yeah, I think a significant portion of modern people casually think of Christ as his surname, like as if there was a historical census somewhere listing a Joseph Christ and a Mary Christ.
It's a very pervasive misconception. Christ is an anglicized version of the Greek noun Christos. And Christos is not a name. It is a direct translation of the Hebrew noun Mashiach, which we pronounce as Messiah.
Both the Greek and the Hebrew words simply mean anointed one.
Right. It derives from the ancient practice of pouring oil over the heads of kings and high priests to signify their divine appointment.
So it is purely a job description.
Purely. When the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, a text known as the Septuagint, the scholars consistently translated the Hebrew word Mashiach as Christos.
It's a title rooted entirely in the political and religious expectations of ancient Judaism for a deliverer.
And this issue of transliterating words instead of actually translating their meaning happens with the villains of the text too. Our sources point out how we handle the word Satan.
Oh, this is a big one.
When English Bibles leave the word Satan as a transliteration, meaning they just spell out the phonetic sound of the Hebrew or Greek word using English letters, it conditions the reader to view it as a proper noun.
Right, a specific name. A mythological villain with a pitchfork operating a subterranean torture chamber.
But if translators were to actually translate the root meaning of the word into English, as some highly literal translations attempt, the word simply means adversary or accuser.
The adversary. Wow. When you read a text about Jesus facing the adversary rather than a cartoonish monster named Satan, the entire tone of the narrative shifts, doesn't it?
Completely. It moves from a comic book cosmic battle to a much more profound, grounded conflict.
The adversary could be a systemic political force, a religious accuser in a courtroom, or even an internal psychological temptation. The terminology we choose literally dictates the shape of the reality we perceive in the text.
Absolutely. So with our lens now adjusted, understanding the messy interpretation of the Greek code and reclaiming the identity of Jehoshua the Anointed One, we can begin constructing the actual timeline of his life.
Let's start at the very beginning, the Nativity.
Establishing the date of birth immediately reveals the friction between conventional history and the texts. In the standard canonical narrative, historians generally place his birth somewhere between 4 to 7 BCE during the reign of Herod the Great.
Which creates that always amusing historical paradox that Jesus was technically born several years before Christ.
Right, it's a remnant of chronological miscalculations made by monks centuries later. However, the Jesus Companion source notes a highly significant historical tension here.
What's that?
The Gospel of Luke anchors the birth narrative to a specific empire-wide event, a census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. This census is not a myth. It is a well-documented historical reality recorded by Roman historians.
Okay.
But it occurred in 86, following the banishment of Herod Archelaus.
Wait, so the historical data suggests he might have been born a full decade later than the traditional timeline claims. Why does a 10-year discrepancy matter so much?
Because of the political climate of 86. That specific census triggered a massive, violent revolt led by Judas of Galilee, which essentially birthed the Zealot movement.
The faction of Jewish insurgents dedicated to violently overthrowing Roman rule.
Exactly. If Jesus was born in 86, he grew up in the immediate, bloody aftermath of that specific revolt. Furthermore, if the 86 date is correct, it means he began his public ministry in his mid-20s, not his traditional age of 30.
That's a huge shift in the timeline. But regardless of the exact year, we have to look at the location and the environment of the birth. This is where we open up one of our most fascinating alternative sources today, the Gospel of the Holy 12.
This text completely shatters the familiar diorama of the wooden stable and the quiet, starlit manger scene you see on modern Christmas cards.
It really does. The environment described in this Gospel is deeply esoteric. According to the Gospel of the Holy 12, Mary and Joseph do not find an inn or a stable. They take refuge in a subterranean cave.
Yes, and this cave is not depicted as a damp, dark, terrifying hole in the ground either. The text explicitly states, "Behold, it was filled with many lights, bright as the sun in his glory."
It is an instantly mystical setting. The illumination isn't coming from a physical fire or a lantern. It is a supernatural radiance filling the space. The symbolism of a glowing cave like the womb of the earth is incredibly potent.
It is.
But the detail that truly blew my mind is the animal kingdom. The traditional nativity gives us an ox and an ass, maybe a sheep. The Gospel of the Holy 12 provides a wildly expansive guest list. Jesus is born surrounded by an ox, a horse, an ass, and a sheep. But the text adds that beneath the manger itself, there was a cat with her little ones.
A mother cat and her kittens.
I mean, I have to challenge this because a cat in a first-century Judean Jewish setting feels incredibly out of place. It sounds like a detail airdropped in from a completely different culture. Why a cat?
You're picking up on a crucial cultural cross-pollination there. Cats were not highly regarded or common in ancient Israelite culture. In fact, they're barely mentioned in the canonical Old Testament at all.
Right.
But in Egypt, cats were profoundly revered. They were associated with Bastet, a goddess of domestic protection, the divine feminine, and childbirth. Oh, wow. So by placing a mother cat directly under the manger, the author of this text is deliberately intertwining Egyptian spiritual symbolism with the Jewish messianic narrative.
Exactly. Furthermore, the text mentions that there were doves also, overhead, and each had its mate after its kind, the male with the female.
So we have the domestic mammals below, the beasts of burden surrounding them, and the birds of the air above. It feels like a meticulously curated microcosm of Noah's Ark.
That is precisely the theological intent. The text explicitly states that Jesus was born in the midst of the animals to signify that through the redemption of humanity, the animal kingdom itself would also achieve redemption and liberation from suffering.
It paints a picture of ultimate cosmic ecological harmony.
And this theme of nonviolence and harmony is heavily reinforced by the visitors who arrive at the glowing cave. We all know the canonical story of the Magi, the wise men following the star.
Right.
But the Gospel of the Holy 12 adds a fascinating ethical caveat about these men. It explicitly describes them as having tasted neither flesh nor strong drink. They are presented as strict vegetarians and teetotalers. They practice an extreme form of asceticism. Why include that specific dietary detail?
It establishes a distinct moral and philosophical baseline from the very first days of his life. The canonical texts portray Jesus later participating in standard dietary practices, including the Passover lamb and wine.
Right, the Last Supper and all that.
But this alternative gospel is aligning the divine birth with an ethos of absolute nonviolence, bodily purity, and strict self-control regarding consumption. It sets the stage for the radical teachings on compassion for all sentient beings that dominate the rest of this specific gospel.
Okay, so following the glowing cave, the timeline hits a massive wall. We have the flight into Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod. We have the canonical story of a 12-year-old Jesus astonishing the religious scholars in the temple in Jerusalem. And then the narrative goes entirely dark.
Total silence.
The canonical timeline provides absolutely nothing until he emerges the Jordan River around the age of 30.
This is the era widely known as the lost years, or the missing years. For nearly 2 decades, the New Testament offers total silence regarding the most influential figure in Western civilization.
Which, I mean, from a biographical standpoint, is maddening. You were skipping over the entirety of his adolescence and his 20s. Those are the formative years where human identity, philosophy, and psychological resilience are forged.
And as the text, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Lao-Tzu explains, conventional New Testament scholars approach this gap with extreme skepticism.
How so?
The historical critical method views the canonical Gospels not as chronological diaries, but as highly crafted theological arguments written decades after his death by anonymous authors relying on shifting oral traditions.
So they don't even see it as a literal biography.
Right. From this academic perspective, the historical person of Jesus is buried beneath such a massive layer of retrospective Christian mythology that the lost years are simply lost to history. Many scholars argue the nativity and the temple stories were just literary inventions designed to fulfill Jewish messianic prophecies.
Meaning, we effectively know nothing about his life before his baptism.
Correct.
But human nature abhors a vacuum. When people see an 18-year gap in the resume of a divine figure, they start furiously filling in the blanks. I mean, if he didn't learn his profound universal wisdom hanging around a carpenter shop in rural Galilee, where did he go? Did he travel the Silk Road? Did he study with Hindu gurus in India or Buddhist monks in the Himalayas?
And this is where our alternative sources provide something truly extraordinary. The Gospel of the Holy 12 does not leave those 18 years blank. It provides a highly specific, deeply humanizing, and frankly shocking narrative.
It fills the void not just with mystical travels, but with domestic reality. According to chapter 6 of this text, at the age of 18, Jesus was espoused to a woman named Miriam.
Miriam, described as a virgin of the tribe of Judah. And this isn't just a brief engagement. The text states they were married and lived together for 7 years.
I want you, the listener, to really pause and consider the psychological weight of a 7-year marriage. 7 years of building a domestic life, sharing a home, managing finances, experiencing the daily friction and profound intimacy of human partnership.
It grounds him in the dirt and the reality of the human condition. It completely removes him from the untouchable, ethereal pedestal of the canonical texts.
But then this domestic life is completely shattered.
Yes. After 7 years, the text records a tragic pivot. Miriam dies. The phrasing in the gospel is stark but deeply purposeful. She died, for God took her, that he might go on to the higher things which he had to do, and to suffer for the sons and daughters of men.
The implication there is so intense. Her death is basically framed as a necessary theological prerequisite for his ultimate mission. I look at this through the lens of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, or even the archetypal origin story of a great philosopher. There is always a profound catalyst that breaks the protagonist out of their ordinary world. If you are destined to become the ultimate teacher of compassion, the healer of human suffering, and the conqueror of death, how can you speak to the depths of the human condition if you have never experienced the agonizing grief of burying someone you love?
Your analogy is spot on. The profound grief of becoming a widower at 25 acts as the crucible.
Wow.
The canonical Gospels present a teacher who seems strangely detached from domestic entanglements, someone who tells his followers to abandon their families to follow him. But this alternative source presents a man whose entire spiritual trajectory is fueled by the catastrophic loss of his wife. His empathy is earned through trauma, not just granted by divine decree.
So what does a grieving 25-year-old widower do to process this loss? The text says he leaves his home. He becomes a seeker,
Having finished his study of the Jewish law, the text says he travels back to Egypt.
bringing the timeline full circle to where he fled as an infant.
The author is drawing another explicit typological parallel to Moses here. Moses was raised in the courts of Pharaoh and learned the mysteries of Egypt. The text states Jesus went to learn of the wisdom of the Egyptians even as Moses did.
It describes a period of intense asceticism, right?
Yes, he goes deep into the desert, meditates, fasts, prays, and obtains the power of the holy name by which he wrought many miracles.
And from Egypt, the travels expand. The text briefly mentions him visiting India and other lands in the East. And this specific detail is the seed that spawned a massive industry of alternative historical theories.
We must be incredibly careful here, though, to distinguish between the ancient texts of the Gospel of the Holy 12 and the sensationalized hoaxes that plagued the 19th and 20th centuries.
Right, our source text, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, LOTZU, explicitly addresses this phenomenon, specifically the infamous legend of Saint Isa.
Oh, the Saint Isa hoax.
This is the hugely popular story claiming a Russian journalist found ancient scrolls in a Himalayan monastery, proving Jesus spent his missing years studying with Tibetan Buddhist lamas.
Yes. Nicholas Notovich published this claim in 1894. But as our expert source, Professor Robert Price, details, it was a complete fabrication.
Just entirely made up.
Notovich's claims were investigated by contemporary scholars and proven to be a hoax. But more importantly, it fails the basic test of geographical and historical reality.
How so?
Buddhism did not even begin to penetrate the region of Tibet until the 7th century CE, over 600 years after the life of Jesus. It is historically impossible for a first-century Jew to have studied Tibetan Buddhism.
People wanted it to be true so badly because of the rise of Eastern philosophy in the West during the late 1800s. But even discarding the Tibetan hoax, the core narrative of our primary alternative text remains. He spent his later 20s in deep mourning, retreating to the Egyptian desert, absorbing mystery traditions, and encountering Eastern philosophies along trade routes before returning to Judea.
And when he returns around the age of 30 to launch his public ministry, the theology he preaches is radically distinct from the rigid patriarchal orthodoxy of his day.
He brings back a philosophy of profound energetic balance.
Which brings us perfectly back to our earlier discussion about the mechanics of the Greek language.
Oh, this is where it all ties together. According to the Gospel of the Holy 12, he introduces a core teaching about the nature of the divine that completely levels the playing field. He does not just pray to God the Father, he introduces the theology of the fatherhood and the motherhood of God.
He refers to the supreme divine reality as the two-in-one. The text records him saying, "In each of you the fatherhood and the motherhood may be seen, for the father and the mother are one in God."
He is arguing for a fundamental internal equality. The divine masculine and the divine feminine are perfectly balanced within the architecture of the universe, and therefore they must be recognized and balanced within the human soul.
And he extends this metaphor of gendered harmony to describe his own mission and his followers. He states, "I and my bride are one, even as Maria Magdalena, whom I have chosen and sanctified unto myself as a type, is one with me."
He explicitly uses Mary Magdalene, a physical living woman, as a biological and spiritual type, or representation of the bride. And the bride represents the entire church, or the elect of humanity. He is elevating the feminine principle to be an equal, essential counterpart to the masculine.
Now, connect this back to the raw data of the Greek language we explored earlier. Modern English readers struggle with the concept of a mother god because English neuters everything into it or defaults to masculine pronouns for deity.
Right. But ancient Greek grammar, with its explicit structural masculine and feminine inflections for every single noun, inherently holds this balance of energies.
Exactly. The language itself is a two-in-one system. A teaching about the profound harmony of the divine masculine and divine feminine would feel entirely organic and native when spoken or written in a language that categorizes the entire universe by gender.
But preaching a message that empowers the marginalized, elevates the feminine principle to equal divine status, and suggests that the supreme authority is an internalized balance rather than an external dictator. That is an incredibly dangerous message in the first century.
It was a direct threat to two massive power structures. It threatened the religious elite in Jerusalem, who maintained power through a strict patriarchal interpretation of the law and temple sacrifices. And it threatened the imperial machinery of Rome, which demanded absolute, unquestioning allegiance to Caesar as the sole son of God.
Which inevitably propels our timeline toward its violent climax. The arrest, the trial before Pontius Pilate, and the Roman execution by crucifixion. And here, our sources provide an incredibly deep, almost medical metaphor for how to interpret his death.
We turn to an excerpt from the Dolorous Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ. This text, based on the visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, unpacks a stunning theological and anatomical metaphor that connects the trauma of the crucifixion directly back to the creation story in the book of Genesis.
Oh, the second Adam connection.
Yes. The Apostle Paul referred to Jesus as the second Adam. The Dolorous Passion takes that title literally and maps the biology of the first Adam onto the death of the second.
Walk us through this mapping, because the imagery is visceral and beautifully symmetric.
Let's look at the Genesis account. When the Creator decides to form a partner for the first Adam, he does not create Eve from the dust of the ground. He casts a deep sleep upon Adam.
Right.
While Adam is entirely unconscious in the surgical sleep, his side is physically open, a rib is extracted, and from that biological material, his wife, Eve, the mother of all the living, is constructed.
Adam wakes up and says, "Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." They are two entities born from one flesh.
Now, the Dolorous Passion applies this exact anatomical sequence to the cross. Jesus, the second Adam, is pleased to let a sleep come upon him, but this is the agonizing sleep of death of crucifixion.
Wow.
While he is hanging unconscious in this sleep of death, his side is physically pierced open by the Roman centurion's spear.
And the Gospel of John notes that blood and water physically flow out of this wound, which modern medical analysts suggest indicates a pericardial effusion, the rupturing of the sac surrounding the heart due to extreme trauma and asphyxiation.
But metaphorically and theologically, the Dolorous Passion claims that from this specific anatomical wound in the side of the second Adam, the second Eve is born.
That is heavy.
The text reads that his side was open so that the second Eve, his virgin spouse, the church, the mother of all the living, might be formed from it.
It is breathtaking. The church is not just a social club or an organization. In this esoteric metaphor, the church is biologically and spiritually extracted from his side during the trauma of death, just as Eve was extracted from Adam.
It perfectly completes the I and my bride are one teaching we discussed earlier.
The physical horror of the cross is entirely reinterpreted as a cosmic birthing process.
It transforms an execution into a genesis. But the sleep of death leads to the tomb. And the empty tomb is where the historical timeline fractures into its most contentious debate, the resurrection.
The canonical claim is straightforward: a supernatural, bodily resurrection from the dead. But our sources dive into the intense rationalist debates of the 18th and 19th centuries, specifically the deist controversy. And this produced one of the wildest historical workarounds I have ever heard: the swoon theory.
To understand the swoon theory, you really have to understand the deist mindset.
Right, explain that for us.
Deism posits that God is like a cosmic clockmaker who wound up the universe and let it run on natural laws, never interfering. Therefore, miracles are philosophically impossible. So rationalist scholars were desperate to find a purely biological, natural explanation for why the tomb was empty on Sunday morning.
And Heinrich Eberhard Gottlob Paulus became the champion of this natural explanation school.
He did. Paulus argued that the entire premise of the resurrection was a medical misunderstanding. He claimed Jesus did not actually die on the cross. The immense trauma, the scourging, the hypovolemic shock from blood loss, it induced a state of suspended animation, a death-like coma, a swoon.
Which is, I mean, it's a huge stretch.
According to Paulus, the Roman executioners simply made a mistake. They took down a comatose man, believing him to be a corpse, and placed him in the rock-hewn tomb. The cool, damp air of the tomb, combined with the rest and the aromatic spices, caused his nervous system to naturally revive.
Which is medically absurd if you understand how Roman crucifixion works. The mechanism of death is asphyxiation. You have to physically push yourself up on the nailed feet just to draw a breath. You don't just swoon and survive that.
It defies all anatomical logic.
But Paulus's theory gets even crazier. He weaves in an ancient conspiracy. He suggests that a secret society, perhaps the Essenes, was monitoring the situation.
Yes. Paulus hypothesized that a member of this secret society dressed in white robes, which, perfectly rationalizes the angel seen by the women, frightened away the Roman guards.
They smuggle the reviving Jesus out of the tomb. And for the next period of time, he occasionally appears to his bewildered disciples. But he is weak, injured, and constantly has to retreat to the secret hideout of the society to receive medical care.
And eventually, Paulus concludes, the physical toll of the crucifixion was simply too much, and Jesus quietly died a natural death in obscurity.
It reads like a 19th century espionage thriller. It is a desperate, convoluted attempt to maintain the historical shell of the narrative while aggressively gutting it of any supernatural power.
But once again, our alternative source, the Gospel of the Holy 12, completely ignores these rationalist theories and provides a vastly different, highly structured account of those post-resurrection days. And it differs from the canonical Acts of the Apostles on a very specific structural detail.
The book of Acts states that Jesus appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days before ascending into heaven. 40 is the ultimate symbolic number in Jewish literature. 40 days of rain in the flood, 40 years wandering in the wilderness, 40 days fasting in the desert.
It implies a period of testing and completion.
But chapter 165 of the Gospel of the Holy 12 extends this period significantly. It claims that Jesus tarried on earth not for 40 days, but for 90 days.
3 full months.
Why does the author need 90 days?
Because of the sheer volume and complexity of the esoteric teachings he is passing on. The text states he tarried with Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene, and the 12, instructing them in the deepest mysteries of the kingdom of God. 40 days is enough to prove you are alive. 90 days is the time required for a master to initiate his disciples into a complex mystical system.
And the culmination of that 90-day masterclass is a final cosmic teaching. He breathes on his disciples, instructing them to receive ye the Holy Ghost. He institutes a mystical communion. But the ultimate message he leaves them with is a grand, sweeping theory of universal mechanics.
In chapter 87, he teaches that the salvation of the world will be achieved by the descent of spirit into matter and the ascent of matter into spirit through the ages.
It is a breathtakingly expansive view of reality. He's not just talking about individual human souls being saved from a legal judgment of sin. He is describing an ongoing, cyclical, cosmic engine. The divine spirit descends to animate, experience, and redeem dense physical matter. And in turn, that physical matter slowly evolves, refines, and ascends back into pure spirit over the eons.
It is an alchemical evolutionary theology that wraps up his teachings on grief, the physical body, the animal kingdom, and the balance of energies into one grand, universal theory of everything.
It is a radically different portrait of the protagonist than the one most people encounter in Sunday school. In tracing this timeline, really forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about how we construct our own understanding of reality.
It does. Let's bring this all together. We started by realizing that reading translations is like looking at a compressed JPEG. We lose the vital gendered data of the Greek language, and we are subjected to the biases of translators who inserted spaces, commas, and capital letters into an unbroken wall of uncial script.
We reclaimed his name, Jehoshua, and saw the profound typological parallels connecting him to the Old Testament conqueror.
We explored a birth not in a wooden stable, but in a glowing subterranean cave, surrounded by a harmonized animal kingdom, including an Egyptian mother cat, visited by ascetic, vegetarian wise men.
We filled the 18-year silence with a profoundly humanizing 7-year marriage to Miriam. We saw how the devastating grief of her death acted as the catalyst for his desert mysticism and his deep study of Eastern and Egyptian philosophies.
We uncovered his radical ministry, preaching the divine feminine, the motherhood of God, and a theology built on the internal balance of the two in one.
We examined the profound anatomical metaphor of the second Adam giving birth to the church from his pierced side. We dismantled the rationalist acrobatics of the swoon theory. And finally, we sat in on a 90-day esoteric masterclass detailing the cyclical descent of spirit into matter.
It is a massive, complex, and deeply beautiful tapestry of alternative history and theology. And it leads us to one final thought for you, the listener, to carry with you today.
Yeah.
Think back to our discussion about those original Greek manuscripts.
All right.
The scriptio continua. One continuous string of capital letters with no spaces and no punctuation. The ancient reader could not just passively consume the text. They were required to actively participate in constructing its meaning. They had to decide where one thought ended and another began. They had to supply the pauses, the emphasis, and the structure based on their own understanding.
Right.
You are doing the exact same thing right now with the unformatted data of your own life. Every event you experience, every conversation you have, every trauma you endure, and every joy you feel is just a raw, unbroken string of data. How much of what you firmly believe to be objective reality, the rigid story of who you are, who your enemies are, and what the world is actually just the punctuation and the spaces that your culture, your history, or your own internal biases have artificially inserted into the raw data of the universe?
If you change where you put the period, do you completely change the meaning of your life story? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the raw files, keep looking past the compressed JPEGs, and most importantly, keep questioning the text of your own lives. We will catch you next time.